Hello, everyone, and welcome to Day 2 of Emerge Financial Health. I am Alejandra Ruales. I lead our measurement work at the Financial Health Network, and I will be your host for today. For those of you that joined us yesterday, we're happy to see you back. If you're tuning in for the first time, welcome and thank you for joining us. Throughout this event, we will be navigating the people and communities that have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic, and the importance of true leaders to define goals and hold themselves accountable to improving financial health for all, and most importantly, for those who are underserved. These conversations are incredibly important for our industry as we think about how we create solutions that break systemic barriers to build financial health solutions grounded in equity. Yesterday, we started the event by taking a look at opportunities to shape the future of financial health through systems change. We discussed the role that policy, infrastructure, and innovation have in building long-lasting, equitable solutions for financial health. Today, we'll focus on those who are affected by the decisions we make, people. We will be reflecting specifically on the disproportionate effects of COVID-19 on women and people of color. We'll discuss how we can use data to advance financial health strategies that are diverse, equitable, and inclusive, and how industry leaders are advancing financial health for their customers, employees, and communities. We'll conclude our day by formally presenting the Financial Health Visionary Award and learning more about our honoree who has played a key role in advancing the mission and vision of financial health at a global scale. Before we get started, I'd like to thank our sponsors. Foundation sponsors, JP Morgan Chase and Prudential Financial. Gold sponsors, BlackRock and PayPal. Silver sponsors, Bank of America, Fifth Third Bank, MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth, and MedLife Foundation. Bronze sponsors, Capital One, Members Development Company, the National Credit Union Foundation, and Opportune. Thank you for your support. A few reminders on logistics. We have a Q&A tool on the right side of this page where we encourage you to share your thoughts, ask questions, and engage with us during the day. We're going to try to do our best to get as many questions solved as possible, but we might not get there, so continue engaging with us. There's going to be also resources at the bottom of the screen. So if you're interested in learning more about the content or about what the speakers are saying, there's going to be research and different resources and links where you can learn more. We also have a chat bubble that you can use in case that you have any technical questions. That's going to be at the bottom right of your screen. And finally, if you're interested in using closed captioning, you can see a link for that at the bottom of my screen. All right, so with that, we're ready to get things kicked off. I am very excited for our first session, a fireside chat with Scott Sanborn, CEO of Lending Club, and Laura Barger, CMO at the Financial Health Network. This session will provide insights into how Scott was able to pivot his company to become a financial health brand and integrate financial health principles into his company's DNA. We'll hear from them in just a few moments.
Hello, everyone. I'm Laura Barger, Chief Marketing Officer at the Financial Health Network. Welcome to Day 2 of Emerge Financial Health. For those who joined us yesterday, welcome back. We had such a terrific day with so many thoughtful and inspirational speakers. I'm excited to be kicking off today's activity with this session, Integrating Financial Health into Your Company's DNA. When I started at the Financial Health Network, formerly CFSI, over 5 years ago, financial health was still a really new term, being rolled out and tested by just a few organizations here and there. And it's since taken root in ways that we could have scarcely imagined back then, finding its way into boardrooms, strategy documents, communications, and much more. And in some truly wonderful cases, we're now seeing it show up as part of an organization's brand promise and positioning, which feels like such a critical milestone in the mission to improve financial health for all. My guest today is Scott Sanborn, the truly thoughtful and visionary CEO of Lending Club, who has led the organization through a brand evolution and recently announced a brand promise as a financial health brand. Scott, I'm so excited to spend some time with you today to learn about this positioning and to hear a little bit more about your journey and how it's impacted your approach to your work as well as how it's affected your workforce. So thanks so much for joining me.
Well, thank you for having me, and you guys have been an important part of the journey.
That's so great. Well, I mean, we'll kick right off. We've only got 20 minutes and I have a million things to talk about, so we'll get going. Let's start at the beginning. Tell me a little bit about your brand journey and what sort of brought you to the evolution and the announcement and the positioning of financial health and sort of what that means for you as an organization.
Yeah, so, we started back in, 2007 was our first loan. It was a pretty broad hypothesis, just, hey, retail banking, one of the last categories to be disrupted by technology. We think, credit's a data problem. Tech company can be positioned to solve that. And if you start with a customer first mindset, you'll be able to really, work on the experience. So that's really where we started. And that turned out to be true in the sense of we, launched with a great product that won a lot of, rave reviews from customers and, got us going. And as we started to get to a place where, okay, how do we get to scale? What's the right product market fit? We found that the number one use case for our product was helping people refinance their credit card debt, effectively lower the cost of their debt and get on a path to getting out of debt. And the more we learned about the customer and that use case, the more amazed we were. And, there's this perception that credit card debt only affects low-income borrowers. And the reality is that the difference in your income, the higher your income, effectively the higher credit card debt you have on average. And that's true all the way up to the top 10% of the American population income earners. So the first 90%, higher the income, higher the credit card debt. And, if you have high cost debt, that likely means you don't have sufficient savings. And if you don't have savings, you're at risk of getting caught in a cycle of debt, not being ready for retirement and all the rest. So, the more we ended up learning and looking at the data, the more we were internally coming to the conclusion that, and we talk a lot about the climate crisis, and, we see a real impending financial health crisis. 2/3 of the country is deemed financially unhealthy. That's your data, based on having insufficient savings, insufficient insurance protection, all the rest. So we just started talking more and more about it and incorporating it more and more into our activities.
That's awesome. And I think that, we talked a little bit, or we talk a lot about what's implementation versus talk, right? And I think you just gave a couple of really good examples, but do you have a couple of other concrete examples of sort of where you've said, we're going to put this out here, this is a promise, what are we going to do to back it up? I mean, personally, I see an example, you actually have a financial health role, right, at the organization that's pretty high up in the C-suite. And so what are some other examples of key product decisions or other ways of kind of practicing what you're preaching on the outcomes of financial health?
Yeah, so, what we've found is that in our business, this doesn't have to be like an either or. Either we're helping the customer do something or we have a good business. And in fact, there's, lots of opportunity, and that's what we're focused on, is alignment between positive outcome for the company, positive outcome for our members. And, one of the most powerful examples was, as I mentioned, when we saw, okay, people are using this to pay down credit card debt. And guess what? For the people who actually do pay down their credit card debt, we see a better outcome. We see their FICO score goes up, usually 20, 30 points, and their overall revolving debt, so their high cost debt, but it's kind of the saturated fat of debt, right? It's unhealthier debt because of the cost and the revolving nature, that goes down. So one of the things, and by the way, they perform better on the loan, lower delinquency rates, higher repayment rates. So we created effectively a balance transfer process as part of the loan application that says, hey, are you going to use this to pay down credit card debt? Great. Which of your credit cards do you want us to pay down for you? Rather than give you the money and put the work on you to do it, we're going to make it easy for you to do what you set out to do by doing it directly. And in exchange for you doing that, we know you're going to perform better on the loan, so we will give you a lower rate. So we're both making it easier for you and we're giving you the benefit, right? You doing this is better for your financial health and therefore you get a benefit. And so there we're winning. We get a better quality loan for the people that are investing in loans, including Lending Club, and the customer gets a lower cost of debt. So that's a perfect example of it, but still lots more work to do.
Yeah, but it's a great start, obviously, and being able to talk about it, right, publicly about, what are some of the ways that you're looking at those outcomes and measuring it and sort of thinking about it beyond the traditional metrics of business success, I think is really interesting. So I want to just shift for a minute to talk a little bit about how the positioning has been received, right? I think that when you go out really publicly with that sort of evolution and that pivot, there's a lot of different audiences for that, right? There's people who are looking at it from the media. There's people that are obviously looking at it from, shareholder perspective, but there's your workforce. Like, how is it received, generally speaking, and how have you kind of dealt with that as you continue to work on your strategic plans?
Yeah, so I'm glad you brought up that, the level of visibility and the reception really varies pretty much by audience. So I guess starting with employees and, employees today can choose to work wherever they want, and having a company that actually has a mission that people respond to is important. So we, as we became more and more passionate about this, we actually sat down and said, okay, let's put together a brand promise that reflects what we're trying to do. And so our brand promise is to champion the financial success of our customers with fairness, simplicity, and heart. And all of those words are important. So we're not saying we're achieving financial success, because you know what? We're one piece of this ecosystem. We can't help if your income is volatile. We can't help if your income is insufficient to cover your debts. But what we can do is give you a fair product that you understand, that is better than the alternatives out there, and we can make it easy for you to do that. So that's what we mean by champion. And the fairness is back to, it's a fair product. It's not free. There are costs associated, but it's fair. And simplicity is, I gave it just recently example. How do we make it really easy for you to do the right thing? And heart is about treating people as people. And so we rolled that out to our employees. That it resonated immediately. There was no debate. I mean, the process of coming up with the brand promise was literally like 2 weeks, because it was so clearly right for us. And it's provided a very helpful lens for employees to say, what is on brand, what is off brand, both in terms of our product innovation and our services. And so examples would be, one of the next products we launched was auto refinance. Why? Because for our customers, auto represents their second largest purchase. And there's a structural unfairness in that market, which is if you buy your car at a used car dealer, you're paying more than you need to. It's your payment amount is not just based on your risk. It's based on fees that get added in that are invisible to you. It was also a driver partially the acquisition of Radius Bank that we recently announced, because they have a digital checking product that rewards you for using your debit card. So it rewards you for using money you have, as opposed to rewarding you to go into debt. So real clarifying lens for employees. It means that things don't have to be driven top down. People understand bottoms up what to do. but different stakeholders perceive it differently. So for shareholders, I would say honestly, it varies. Increasingly, we're a little behind Europe. ESG issues, right? Social issues are becoming important to shareholders. So us, for those shareholders being able to share, hey, this is what we're doing. We're making credit more affordable. We're making it more accessible, and we're helping people improve their financial condition. That can really matter. For other investors, what they care about is show me the financials, show me the growth.
Yeah, no, understood. And it also occurs to me that, sort of coming out among the first sort of large organizations or institutions that's taking the financial health into their brand, there may be a perception of, oh, are we just trying to own it? Is this an exclusive? But, even in past discussions with you, it's pretty clear that you see this as a large tent, right? No one organization can own this brand of being a financial health company. And so, it'd be interesting for me to hear, do you get into conversations with other leaders about this? Like, are you getting any questions about how that's resonating? We're particularly interested just to understand, are we going to see more of this? And do you think that that's going to really start to change the tide?
So, I guess starting with, the question of, gosh, is this space too crowded? Does somebody own it? No, nobody's going to own this. Just like nobody owns having food that's good for you, right? And I would also separate out the mission of the company and the orientation of what kind of products and services you want to deliver to your customer versus your marketing materials, right? We don't, our advertising doesn't say, come to Lending Club because we're going to improve your financial health. Our advertising says, hey, you didn't pay off your credit card last month, which means you have a loan, and it's not a good one. We're going to give you one that is lower cost, better for your FICO score, and gets you out of debt faster. So that's what our advertising says. It's much more concrete. So I'd distinguish between how we think about ourselves and our mission versus how we're messaging customers, right? It's kind of like within a restaurant, telling people we're going to have the healthiest food might not actually drive a bunch of people, but having a restaurant that has healthy food, puts calorie counts on the menu so that you can make right choices, is probably going to be a better business outcome while still delivering a good outcome for the customer. So we are, thankfully seeing more people talking about this. And that's great because the problem is massive. I mean, I don't need to tell you, Laura, the problem is massive. No one company is going to solve this. And, the entrance of a lot of fintechs, ourselves included, are starting to chip away at some of the practices that that help create bad outcomes for customers. There's been a lot of press recently about, banks moving away from charging overdraft fees, which, that's our product as well, because 8% of the customers pay like 80 or 90% of the overdraft fees. And it's, it is deeply unfair to that segment, and there are better solutions available. So people are talking about it. More importantly, people are making changes like the one I just indicated, but we are still very early in the journey, and the problem is quite significant.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I want to just shift back a little bit to the idea of outcomes, right, and holding yourselves accountable. And I know, most organizations, yours included, are still at the beginning part of a journey of kind of measuring and understanding like a KPI, right, to what financial health really looks like. Can you talk just a little bit about what some of your thoughts are there and what your plans are, how you're going to start, measuring the outcomes and how that's going to play into your reporting and so forth?
Yeah, so I would agree. We're at the beginning, but we're making good progress. We're very excited about the path ahead. So for us, the big change for us is by acquiring a bank charter and giving us the ability to deliver banking services such as, checking accounts. We have the ability to affect people beyond a transaction, right? What our core product is great. We're going to lower your cost of debt, improve your FICO score. But what happens 2 years later, it's sort of out of our hands, right? And what we've seen is we lower your debt, we improve your FICO score, you get buried with new credit card offers. And, not everybody is able to resist those and stay out. So with the addition of the bank and the checking account, we're going to have the ability to stay with our customers ongoing. We're going to have insights into spend, into income patterns, and we're going to have visibility to and the opportunity to find additional ways to help them, right? So we'll be able to see what's happening and say, hey, your payment date just changed. Maybe you should use move your mortgage date so that it corresponds to when you get paid. So we are in anticipation of that future. We have built dashboards that are meant to measure a set of defined metrics over time to measure a customer's health. So we're looking at things like FICO scores, total unsecured debt, revolving debt balances, so that we can track people over time. And now that we have the ability to communicate more easily with them, we think we'll be able to drive a differentiated outcome.
Yeah, and I can say even just on a personal level that having that information and getting in a place where you can share that, right, broadly, just to show the connections, right, of all of the different types of activity and financial situations that people are in, how it just affects certain stages of their lives. I think that's going to be massively powerful because we do live in a place right now where we see a certain snapshot, and that's the snapshot that we focus on. And so I think what you're doing here is kind of creating a bigger 3D. So
yeah,
I know
bigger 3D and making it customer centric as opposed to product centric. So what can very easily happen at large organizations is people get siloed. The people doing mortgages are just trying to sell mortgages, and the people doing auto loans are just trying to sell auto loans, and so on and so on and so on. And so the aggregate impact of what's happening with the customer can get lost. So we're really excited, and was real work to kind of make it customer centric and be able to see how different products over time influence them, and different nudges and communications will be able to influence them.
That's great. Well, with only just a couple minutes left, I will leave you with the question of if there are other leaders out there who are considering a brand shift or thinking about integrating financial health a little bit more visibly, what kind of advice would you give them? Any tips on how to approach that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big question is your customer better or worse off for having interacted with you than if they didn't? And it feels like a simple question, but it's actually not. And I don't know that everybody's asking it, right? How do you measure that? Over what time frame? Are there certain practices you're engaged in that are good business but might actually be creating a bad outcome for the customer? And is there a situation that you helped create that led to a bad outcome? So, I think it is a very, very worthwhile topic. And again, over the long term, it is good business. If you look at our business, and this is some information we've shared publicly, it's part of our journey to focus on membership as opposed to a customer and a transaction, and rewarding people for doing good things. We also reward people when they come back. We recognize you as a member. The process is that much easier. Your rate is that much better. So half of our customers come back to us within 5 years to do business with us again, right? Yeah. And they're able to do business with us because they're in a good shape, right? And because we delivered on their behalf. So it is not, this does not require you to be a nonprofit.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate that. And I will say that, very thankful that there are folks like you out there and leaders like you out there thinking about this and I would just encourage folks. I know people have been putting things in the chat, and thank you so much, and we'll answer as much as we can and also refer if we can to be helpful. But I just wanted to say thank you so much for joining us and for sharing that. It was a really wonderful, inspiring conversation.
All right. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you, Laura and Scott. It's exciting to see Lending Club's full integration of financial health, not only as a brand, but really thinking about integrating financial health across internal practices. I love Scott's point about not having to choose between customer and business, or about it being an either or situation. I think that's really where we start thinking about how do you build a case for financial health, and Lending Club is getting there certainly, which is exciting because it opens the door, from my perspective, for more companies to join the movement and to look at their business practices and brands and all of these with a financial health lens. So for our next session is going to be moderated by Sala Goss from MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth, and it will unpack the reasons behind the disproportionate economic impact COVID-19 has had on women, particularly women of color. Joining Sala, we'll have two expert panelists, Kavya Bagul from Jazz Capital and Lalaine Bigelow from National Partnership for Women and Families. They will be with us shortly.
Imagine coming to work and focusing on what you need to get your job done without distraction, because you have the financial security that can make for a better life at home and peace of mind at the office. That's a goal everyone dreams of, but not one that everyone believes they can achieve. Maybe you're worried about making ends meet today, or you're planning for the future and could use some help figuring things out. Now's the time to take advantage of financial wellness from Prudential, a connected set of web-based and in-person experiences created from the ground up. With it, you can learn to confidently address day-to-day money matters and help achieve your most important life goals, like college savings or retirement, while protecting your assets and your loved ones from key risks. Using the Wellness Toolkit is simple. Start with a quick assessment of your financial health to understand where you are and what actions you need to take to help get you where you want to be. Based on your life goals, we bring you the Financial Wellness Center, a personalized experience including videos, articles, and tools to help you make confident choices. The interactive content is constantly refreshed and includes tools and guides to retirement, estate planning, budgeting, and other topics to help you chart your future needs and manage your day-to-day. Each online experience takes only minutes to read, watch, or complete. Everything can be saved to reference later and can be shared with loved ones so that you can work together to help achieve family financial goals. You'll also be able to tap into webinars and attend live seminars to understand new ways to make the most of your benefits and achieve what you want from life. And you can even talk with a professional to get the answers you need when you need them. As you learn more about your financial choices, decisions become clearer and can be carried out with more confidence. No matter if you need to get back on track or want to explore new possibilities, you can enjoy what Prudential calls the wellness effect. Being able to set aside financial concerns that hold you back so you can focus on moving forward with the rest of your life.
Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Sala Goss, and I'm the Senior Vice President, heading up social impact for North America at the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth. Today, we will have what I know will be a lively and robust conversation on the impact of COVID on women, and especially the disproportionate impact on Black, Hispanic women, and other women of color. To me, what is particularly critical about this conversation is our focus on the economic impact. And not because this is a narrowing of the subject, but because it gives us an opportunity to acknowledge how all-encompassing and complex the economic lives of women really are. Women are often primary decision makers in household expenses and budgets, are multi-generational caretakers, making economic decisions often for both children and older parents. And women have exponentially, before the pandemic, increased their buying power. But the outsized contribution to what some call the female economy relies on women's ability to productively contribute to the workplace and to earn a living that supports them and the households that they care for. The fallout of the pandemic has called this very thing into question. It has exacerbated existing disparities and structural shortcomings to women's access to quality jobs, and especially Black and Latinx women. So there's a lot to dig into here, and I couldn't think of two better people to have this conversation with than the two women who are joining me today. It's with great pleasure that I introduce our panelists to this conversation. Joining me is Lelaine Bigelow, Interim Vice President for Congressional Relations and Economic Justice at the National Partnership for Women and Families, and Kavya Vangul, Senior Director of Research for Just Capital. Welcome, Kavya. Welcome, Lelaine. So let's dive in. Let's start with our first question, and I think this will help set the scene for our discussion. I want to dig into a little bit how the pandemic has exacerbated workplace disparities for women, and especially women of color. To kick us off, Lelaine, let me ask you to share some important facts, providing us with a shared baseline to start the conversation. Lelaine, over to you.
Thank you so much. And I definitely want to say thank you to the Financial Health Network for inviting me to be on this panel, and my colleagues at MasterCard and Just Capital. It's an honor to be on the panel with you, and I'm really excited to talk about this. I think it's really important to say that it wasn't just the pandemic, but structural racism and patriarchy are to blame for the suffering of women and women of color in this moment. And I know it sounds like a very bold statement, but I hope by the end of this conversation, you'll feel differently. Things were not fine before, and they got even worse. And I want to give credit to Senator Klobuchar for the following stats that I'm going to say, because I heard her say it this morning, and I thought they were so compelling. But in 1955, women were a third of the labor force, and we've made progress. And in January 2019, women were a larger part of the labor force than men. But when we look at the pandemic, women have lost more than 1 million more jobs than men. And that's a crisis. And why did they leave? They left because we have a caregiving crisis. The individual reason, over 10 million people cite that caregiving is the reason why many people stopped working. And women are largely caregivers in our society. Women of color tend to experience greater health needs and have more caregiving responsibilities. And some of those health needs are rooted in inadequate care of structural racism. And women also experience the wage gap. Women in the United States are paid 82 cents for every dollar to men, amounting to an annual gender wage gap of over $10,000. For women of color, it's worse. Black women are typically paid 63 cents. Native American women are paid 60 cents, Latinas are paid 55 cents, and Asian American and Pacific Islanders are paid as little as 52 cents to the dollar. And it's kind of frustrating sometimes when you talk about it in cents, but it's real money, because if we eliminated the wage gap, women could afford more than 13 additional months of childcare, nearly 65 weeks of food, that's more than a year, more than 9 additional months of rent. So it's real money to people, and it makes an economic impact. And I know we're going to touch on this a little bit more later, but the caregiving crisis really has a detrimental effect on economic mobility and security for women and women of color. Getting a good job and keeping it is one of the best ways to improve a person's economic standing. So when people leave work, it hurts financially. And for older workers, leaving the workforce can mean over $300,000 in lost wages and retirement. So I'll just wrap up here and just say the caregiving crisis really affects women and women of color across their lifespan.
Thank you. And Kavya, can I ask you to add to this? In your view, how has the pandemic exacerbated workplace disparities for women?
Absolutely. Thank you. Again, thank you to the Financial Health Network and my colleagues on this panel for having us. So I think about things a lot from the corporate perspective, because at Just Capital, we focus a lot on how corporations play a role in this larger kind of crisis that's going on. And one of the things that I think is important to add to this is that women of color are disproportionately on the front lines of the pandemic, both at health risk for COVID, but also in industries that have been hit hardest by unemployment claims and fast job loss. And when we think about kind of the ways that occupational segregation works and this dynamic that the COVID crisis has brought along, I wonder too how the disparities in types of jobs that women have, and specifically women of color have, and not having access to the types of benefits that would enable them to take the time off that's necessary for caregiving, play a role in exacerbating some of these disparities as well.
Yeah, and I guess you guys have painted a really good picture. You talked about existing structural inequalities, the caregiving crisis, the types of jobs that women have and the vulnerability that creates. So now that we have a good picture of what's occurred, let's switch gears a little bit and focus on the future. And I'm wondering to what extent the trends that we've just discussed will shape the economic lives of women going forward. We know that studies across multiple institutions show the impact of COVID could dramatically, potentially reverse any progress made in securing workplace and pay equity for women, especially when adding in the factors we talked about, like race, ethnicity, having children, or being the primary breadwinner. The impact to women, I would say, therefore, is not just a woman's problem, but affects the overall economy. And I actually think there's a risk to economic security and our ability to have inclusive growth. And because of this, some would argue that inaction could cost billions and set gender equity back as far as a generation. So let me come back to you, Lelaine. What would you say to this? What do you think the impact will be? What will we see this impact in terms of the future of the economic lives of women going forward because of the pandemic?
Yeah, well, women are not sharing in what we're seeing as in the recovery right now. About 3/4 of the job gains went to men. And Black and white women actually saw employment losses last month, losing 20,000 and 42,000 jobs respectively. So, when you mentioned the $1 billion, it's $500 billion in lost economic activity because women don't have access to paid leave. And that was before the pandemic. So I can't imagine what those numbers are now. And that definitely has an impact on, from everyone, from the individuals to the larger scale economic business, businesses. So I think that it's really important to be thinking about this as not just an individual problem and, families just haven't gotten organized enough to be able to take care of their loved ones. This is a national economic situation.
Yeah. Tavia, would you add anything to that perspective?
Yeah, I think just re-emphasizing some of those important statistics that Lelaine spoke about too. Unmet childcare needs impact employers as well. Prior to the pandemic, employers were estimated to lose about $12.7 billion a year due to breakdowns in childcare or dependent care arrangements that led to lower employee productivity, greater absenteeism, and greater turnover. And when we've started looking at this in the context of the COVID crisis, there have been studies from Brookings that have shown that the school closure costs alone will be about $56 billion per month in lost productivity. And as the crisis continues, we see that there's more long-term effects on the overall financial well-being for not just those immediate women and their families, but the broader economy. And so I'd add those things. I'd also like to say that I think when we think about this broader context and the broader situation, women as breadwinners is critical. Thinking about how Black women and Latina women are core breadwinners in their communities and in their families, especially compared to other race and ethnic groups. And women historically have faced longer spells of unemployment at higher rates than other groups, specifically women of color, which really leads us to think about the downstream effects of what this pandemic could cause, especially if we're not addressing it now with the right types of caregiving instruments. We've also known that this rampant care crisis is blossoming and exploding even more now with the pandemic at large. And we're also seeing longer-term trends around labor market discrimination that will continue to be a problem as women try to re-enter the workforce.
Yeah, and I think those are all important points. And maybe I can just mention three when I think about the future. And you guys kind of mentioned some of this, so maybe just to to summarize what was said and maybe add hopefully a few new ideas, is that we cannot forget, we've mentioned, but we cannot forget about the long-standing structural inequalities that we saw were fueled by racism, sexism, ethnic stereotypes, and other forms of bias. They've created an uneven playing field or landscape that makes it difficult for many women of color to secure jobs with solid wages, but also robs them of the opportunity to easily re-enter the workforce or, when doing so, have career advancement. I think the second thing, and relatedly I would mention, is that I hope we consider well-being. We want to invest in women's productivity, but also in women's happiness. And I was just reading a study from Women in the Workplace's 2020 study that shows that despite all the efforts that companies are making to support employees during the crisis, women are feeling more exhausted, burnt out, and under even more pressure. So to me, this suggests that companies need to do more to adjust to the norms and expectations to create a better support system to help facilitate women's entry back into the workforce. And then finally, I hope that we think about reskilling. We saw during the pandemic, automation and digitization trends accelerate. And as women re-enter the economy and the economy re-emerges, I think we need to think about women's pathways to this and re-engaging in the workforce, because this could be even steeper and made even steeper by the need to reskill or even find a new career pathway. So let's stay on the role of employers for a minute. And I'll ask you, Kavya, to weigh in here. In your view, what or even government agencies can do, either in the short or the long term, to address the ongoing effects of COVID-19 on the economic lives of women?
I think that's a fantastic question, and I'll preface it by saying that there's a lot of room for employers in this space, largely because employers don't put enough of an emphasis on family economic security, and when they do, it's concentrated to certain industries. So there's a large space that employers can take and play, especially as we're waiting on kind of federal provisions to take place. And what these spaces really are things like paid leave. During the pandemic, our data showed that just 21% of the largest employers in the United States, this is the Russell 1000, provided a new or expanded paid leave. That's 21%. It's a small number, and there's a lot of room for companies to step up and provide those provisions for workers, women and women of color, especially as they have caregiving responsibilities due to health issues, due to and kind of care arrangements and all of those items. On the note of dependent care specifically, before the pandemic, we found that a vast majority of companies aren't providing any type of child care benefit or dependent care benefit to working parents. Our research and data collection, 6% of companies provided childcare through center-based or on-site care. 8% were offering subsidies for dependent care, and 15% were offering a backup care subsidy for times when care arrangements fall through. Take a look at what happened during the pandemic. Just 9% of companies expanded these specific backup dependent care or subsidy-based dependent care benefits for their employees. And that shows that there's a huge space that employers can begin to take up, to step up to the plate, to provide the types of dependent care benefits that are necessary for addressing the type of caregiving crisis that we're experiencing right now. The challenge, too, is kind of on the structure of the benefits that companies provide. Employers often constrain these benefits to things like backup care. But we know from all of our research outside that backup dependent care is only solving one very small piece of the larger caregiving crisis. If there is an ongoing care crisis, something that families are experiencing every day. And so 15 days of backup care doesn't do nearly enough to address what it is that families need at this time. I think also it's critical for employers to focus on the racial equity aspects of all of the decisions that they're making as they move towards hiring and considering kind of turnover rates at their companies. So anti-discrimination policies is certainly a space where employers can step up. And a number of our research elements from Just Capital show that companies are making the commitments, but following through on the actual active steps that they can do to address these kind of disparities in labor market discrimination fall short. Additionally, pay equity analyses. We know that companies have pay inequities. We see that from EEOC filings, but addressing those and being real about where they are and how they plan to move forward and basically ameliorate differences in pay becomes even more important. And I'd be remiss to say I have to say that part of this whole equation is about raising wages as well. With conversations about the ongoing labor shortages, it's very clear that we have a wage issue, which has been going on for a very long time. So paying a living wage to workers, especially women and women of color who are working disproportionately in low-wage jobs, is something that is critical as part of this entire package that employers can provide.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned the wage gap, because I think it was Lelaine who corrected my billions and had a comment on that. And can you just reiterate, because I think that was a pretty striking number, and Kavya picked up on it too, this issue of the wage gap. Can you just dig into that a little more if you don't mind, Lelaine?
Sure. And I think you just said billions, and I just put the actual number that I know, which is 500 billion into it. Yeah. So that's a lot of economic activity for the economists that love that word. So I just think that, to kind of go through some of those numbers again for the wage gap. So Black women are typically paid 63 cents to the dollar, Native American 60 cents, Latinas 55 cents, and Asian American and Pacific Islander women are paid as little as 52 cents. I mean, that's just atrocious. There's no other word for that. And there's so much rooted into how those numbers have stayed so low. And a lot of it is because of the caregiving crisis and when people have to leave work. And, to kind of circle back to the original question, I think, what you mentioned too was I think employers really understood, before the crisis that it was important for people to be at work. But after this crisis, they need to understand it's okay for people to be away from work. And that is what we all need to learn, I think, as a part of the employment system. And the thing that I would say too is care is infrastructure. That's what we need to all think about, because if we don't, it will impede our economic recovery. And it's not just going to trickle down because if we do the roads and bridges, everything will be okay, because physical infrastructure jobs are male dominated. Over 90% of those jobs go to men, and men also need to care for their kids and also need to care for their parents. And so we should be thinking about this in a more gender equitable way if we want to realize true recovery and get to those hundreds of billions of dollars.
Yeah. And did you want to add anything on the question of what can employers or even government agencies or policies do to help alleviate this?
Oh, sure. I mean, we need a care infrastructure. So we need a national paid leave policy, and we need to invest in childcare. And they can't be thought of as okay, we can only do one and maybe we'll do the other later. We need a full system of supports, which was Kavya was saying, to really help people deal with caregiving across the lifespan. And I think there's a lot of conversation too about people who are in the sandwich generation. And I don't think enough conversation too has been around supporting older workers and how they're caregiving for their parents.
Yeah. And I want to maybe just take a breath for a minute. We have heard these numbers that we're all throwing out. And I think one of you said they were startling or disturbing, whichever word you use. Yes, I agree. And it's really important to show the economic impact. But let me ask you both, because you're subject matter experts, you're working on this day to day. Can you just tell us a little bit about the impact you've seen on women? Not just women as, functioning pieces of the economy that will help us move forward, but some of them may be the personal impacts or stories of what this really means. It affects us all. I mean, we're all women, we can relate, but even those who can't, you should be able to think about something even if you don't go through it. But I think it's still important to tell some of the human stories. So can I just ask either of you just to weigh in and give us kind of a picture of what this looks like?
I can jump in and just say, I think this is not the economic case, but it can be because it can mean life or death for a lot of people. So if you have a cancer diagnosis and you are looking to care for yourself, if you don't have paid leave and you can't take time to go to your treatments and you're stressed out about that, we have seen what that stress and that inability to get care, has on people's lives. And I think that is what comes to mind to me first and foremost when I've seen people share their stories is, it really becomes about picking up their parents on the side of the road because they have Alzheimer's and they've left the house and they're very stressed out about their job and taking the time off to go find their parents. And those are the kind of, sort of tragic stories that, don't make up a lot of numbers, but I think are really poignant to just illustrating the story that people are going through a tough time and you're not going to organize your way out of it. And they also don't deserve to lose their job at a moment of crisis.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, one of the stories that keeps coming back to my mind, and one of the common threads between the stories that I've heard, is this idea of, we think a lot about kind of the benefits that we need to be providing in order to cover the gaps for caregivers, but what do we think about the actual types of benefits and supports that caregivers need? One theme has been this idea of respite. What's the type of rest? What's the type of kind of sanctuary that these caregivers can take, especially after being responsible for caregiving for multiple generations, for their families, and how do they begin to take care of themselves? And so what are the types of benefits that we need to think about for actual caregivers, understanding that these caregivers disproportionately are women and women of color?
Yeah, we just have a couple minutes left, but I just wanted to ask you guys to think about and maybe express, what do we lose if we don't act? I know I mentioned that inaction can cost billions to the economy and perhaps can set a lot of the progress back that we made, but in your words, what's at risk here? What do we lose if we don't take care of this crisis? Kavya, I'll start with you.
Sounds good. Honestly, we are already on an extremely precarious pathway where we are now. And if all of these things are exacerbated, we'll continue to see challenges that women face in terms of employment, in terms of discrimination, in terms of wage inequities. All of these things will be exacerbated. And I think that will have detrimental impacts to our economy. But we also have to think about it from kind of a value perspective as well. This is not just an economic equation. There's a fundamental value shift that is required of people in the United States and many other countries to begin to understand the importance of caregiving and the value that it has, not just to our economy, but to the people that we are and the people that we nurture. And so I think there's a lot to lose economically, especially because the current path that we're on will only get worse.
Lelaine, anything to add?
Well, I will just say that to me, paid leave checks all the boxes. It's economic security, it's healthcare, it's public health, it's racial equity, it's infrastructure, and it's gender equity. So it's really amazing that you can kind of do all of this positive stuff for the American people and for our country by enacting really good national policy. And so those are the things that I really wish that we could think about, that like, wow, this policy helps a ton of people and it's, worth the investment.
Well said. And I always like to leave the conversation with a call to action. So if you would have anyone watching either remember one thing you said, well, I'm not going to make it that easy. If you could inspire action of anyone watching, what is the one thing you would say in terms of a call to action? And Lelaine, I'll stay with you to have you go first.
Yeah. And I'll just say that these policies are really politically popular. So when you poll childcare, when you poll paid leave, you have over 70% of Republicans and Democrats and independents support this policy. So that's pretty much 100% in most people's minds. And so these are things that I think aren't partisan issues, and we should be able to work in them in that way. And so when I think about the conversation that's happening in DC around the American Jobs Plan and the American Families Plan, my call to action is to both of those need to pass together. We don't need to choose one or the other, and that they go together for a true gender equitable recovery.
Well said. Kavya, what's your call to action?
My call to action is that companies have expressed that there is a deep interest that they have in addressing the diversity, equity, and inclusion issues that they've finally begun to witness and understand over the past year. And I think if companies truly care about diversity of their workforce, they care about addressing structural racism, if they care about addressing gender inequities, they should see caregiving as part of their responsibility of the set of benefits that they need to be providing to support family economic security.
What a great note to end on. So I'd like to thank you both. I know in preparing for this, we were saying how excited we were to have this conversation because we're hearing here and there about the effect of women, but you two as subject experts lay it out so well, make it come to life. So I want to thank you both for what's been an invigorating conversation. I think we've learned a lot. I certainly have. And I'm sure you've inspired some folks to action. So I think now we're going to take a few questions from the audience. So send in the questions, keep them coming. And so let's keep this conversation going. So the first one I see is, in this era of intense political division, how might policymakers position these solutions as politically palatable and beneficial to our entire economy? And I think, Lelaine, you started saying that these policies are popular. So what would you say to that question? How can you even further position some of these policy recommendations so they're not polarizing?
Yeah, well, I think it's good to know that, just to reiterate that they aren't truly polarizing. And I think that when you look at the economic case that we've laid out, they sort of pay for themselves as well, because inaction, like you said, also costs money. And so are we really just going to stay and do nothing and lose billions of dollars from the economy? Are businesses going to continue to lose women from the workforce when they know that impacts their bottom line? And are we going to let individuals suffer when they have to take care of their families? And so those are nonpartisan issues. And when you talk to members, I'd say one-on-one, they believe in those things. It's often about, getting away from the theater of it all and really making the case to them one-on-one. And so we've had Republicans and Democrats support these policies, both for paid leave and childcare. It's just about trying to get something done in Washington, which I know is difficult, but that's my job and I really like it. So I will say I'm really optimistic that we're going to see progress on both of those issues.
Great. Kavya, anything to add quickly? I know we're almost.
No, I think Lelaine covered it really well. And so I'd agree. I'm optimistic. I think that from the company perspective where I live on this side of the issue, I definitely am seeing changes in the data, changes in kind of company policy and disclosure on these topics and a greater engagement around it. And so really eager to see that take on more widely.
Yeah, and what a great question to end with. So thank you both very much for this conversation, and thank the audience for tuning in and for this platform to have the conversation. Take care, everybody.
Thank you, Kavya, Salah, and Lelaine. As you mentioned, women have suffered the consequences of antiquated and patriarchal policies or lack of them way before the pandemic. So I'm very glad we're having these conversations because it makes it really, really hard to continue ignoring the fact that we're in dire need for policies like decent childcare infrastructure, progressive work-family policies, and equal pay. This is, to me, the moment where we decide if we'll continue to turn a blind eye on women or take a hard look at the data and start reversing the trends that affect women, families, and policies. So thank you for such a powerful conversation. I am very excited now to introduce this next session focused on how data can be used to support the financial health of customers and employees. The panelists will discuss different approaches to leveraging customer data while maintaining user privacy. Kelly Cochran from FinReg Lab will moderate this discussion between Jasmine Thomas from Citi and Rob Curtis from Daylight. I'll turn it over to them shortly.
I'm starting a panel right now. Hello and welcome to our panel titled Leveraging Customer Data Ethically to Advance Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. My name is Kelly Cochran. I'm the Deputy Director of FinReg Lab. We're a nonprofit research organization focused on the use of data and technology in financial services with a particular focus on the ways that data and technology can potentially reach underserved consumers, small businesses, and other populations. It is often said that what gets measured gets managed. And for diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, there are two very important implications of that maxim. One is to think through how we effectively gather the data necessary to really measure the impact of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives and of financial services and products more generally on the long-term financial health of the customers who receive and use those products and services. The second question is to think through how we protect the trust of those customers, particularly for populations who may have particular concerns about data safety, about usage or privacy considerations. We have two panelists here today to talk through these issues. I'm really excited to hear their thoughts. One is Rob Curtis from Daylight, and the other is Jasmine Thomas from Citi. I'm going to give them a minute to introduce themselves and then do some quick housekeeping before we dig in on the substance. Rob, do you want to start?
Hi, Kelly. Thank you very much for having us today. My name is Rob Curtis. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Daylight. Daylight is the first and only digital banking platform that's designed specifically for the needs of around 30 million LGBT Americans. Happy to go into lots of details on that, but really our job is to help people improve their financial well-being, to give them choices and data that allow them to shop with purpose, and fundamentally come to a place where there is going to be expertise that helps them to understand how their unique financial journeys, and I say journeys rather than one, needs specific kinds of support. So really, really pleased to be here talking about data, which I love. I'm a data geek.
Great. Jasmine?
Hi, I'm Jasmine Thomas. I'm the Director of U.S. Business Partnerships at Citi, where I lead Citi's Action for Racial Equity. It's a 3-year, a little over $1 billion initiative that's designed to invest strategically in initiatives that help close the racial wealth gap across the U.S. And I look forward to discussing more about how we're looking at data with that partnership and project.
Great. Well, obviously we have really interesting initiatives underway and things to talk about, so we'll dive right in. We don't have a very long panel. Just in terms of housekeeping, we're going to start with some questions to both Rob and Jasmine, and then we're going to hopefully save a little time at the end for a few questions. So we ask audience members to go ahead and add questions to the chat so that we can be looking ahead, and we will do our best to save some time. So the first question I wanted to ask to both of you, which is really just to if you could describe how your organizations are using data and how that's connected to your particular focus on DEI or on reaching underserved populations more generally. Jasmine, maybe we can start with you on this question.
Sure. Thank you, Kelly. And again, it's a pleasure to join you all and talk about our work at Citi. We've enjoyed more than a decade of partnership with Financial Health Network and Emerge, so congratulations on just another great lineup. So as I mentioned, I lead Citi's Action for Racial Equity, which we launched last September. So rather than just, commit grant dollars, we actually wanted to lead with our core capabilities. So we deployed 2 parallel strategies, and I'm going to talk to you about just one of them. And that's really the analytic capabilities of Citi. Particularly we leveraged the Independent Global Economic Research Group. And really, they took a close look at data. And the Citi GPS report, which was launched last September, made a clear, compelling economic case for closing the racial wealth gap and focusing on equity. And specifically, what it taught us was that, there's some more of the same has consequences when we look at not addressing inequity. And specifically, one of the biggest kind of data points that came out of it, actually two, was that if the U.S. had closed racial wealth gaps in America in the areas of wages, housing, education, and investments in small business and capital, if we did that 20 years ago to close it, an additional $16 trillion could have been added to the economy. That was just 20 years ago. But if we started today, another $5 trillion could be added. So that's pretty compelling for us as a bank and a financial services institution to take a closer look at where we can add value and lead as an institution. And really, the data really suggested that there was no zero-sum narrative when it comes to looking at financial inclusion and the racial wealth gap, but that there was an opportunity for us to lead. And it moved us and hopefully other institutions that are capital investors to look beyond the social case and the moral case to really focus on the economic business case. And I'll stop there to give Rob a chance to chime in.
Thank you. I think that was very, very comprehensive. And I think probably the best place for us to start is to talk about the LGBT community as a whole. The reason Daylight exists is because people think we're a single group. And many of y'all will be thinking about the financial lives of LGBT folks with shorthands like 2 incomes, no kids, lots of disposable income. And I think one of the things that we know is that, yes, there are lots of two-parent homes with, two adult homes with no children. That group definitely exists. They're probably white folk, they're probably men, they probably live on one of 2 or 3 coastal cities. At the other end of the spectrum, 20% of queer people of color are unbanked or underbanked. And so the first thing about data that we want to get everyone on the same page about is that there is a complete lack of LGBT data at a macro level that describes the needs of our community. And why that's important is because incumbent banks comes to this time of year, it's Pride, we're really excited to show our support for the community. Y'all don't know very much about us. And so what we get is lots of rainbows on stuff. Love a rainbow doesn't actually help me close the LGBT wealth gap. And so the first way that we use data is we're engaging with a number of corporate partners and the Center for LGBT Evidence-Based Applied Research, CLEAR, to do the most comprehensive study on LGBT money that's ever existed in the US. Because the first thing we need to do is to understand the community that we're serving. Daylight exists because y'all don't understand us well enough, and that means that you're not able to serve us well enough. Because we aren't all the same. We have incredibly wide ranges of financial outcomes. We don't quite reach the heights that y'all reach, but we certainly plumb the depths that you do. So how do we build upon a real lack of an evidence-based environment in which to build financial inclusion products? We ask our customers, and we ask questions that y'all probably wouldn't think are natural in a banking environment. And I'm going to get really personal. I'm going to share 3 pieces about myself that will tell you a little bit about how Daylight can serve me. I'm a gay man. I'm a parent. I'm a HIV positive person. All 3 of those things are really important to know to serve me well enough. My healthcare needs need to be recognized and funded. So my status as a HIV positive person, which is considered to be a protected class, is important for us to understand. The fact that I'm a gay man means I'm a protected class again. very important for us to understand. The fact that I'm a parent is really important too. And so really how we're trying to turn banking on its head at Daylight is to treat the LGBT people with the respect that we give the rest of the community, which is detailed micro-segmentation of LGBT people based on their attitudes, their behaviors, their financial status, as well as things like their identity and their goals. And so our ethos to Daylight is we have an obligation as a financial system to understand more about our community. And so we're relatively early in our journey, but we're going to be using all of that kind of data in order to provide the best services. I noticed somebody asked in the chat room whether we're supporting people with disabilities. LGBT folks are 3 to 5 times more likely to suffer from mental health conditions. That means our healthcare costs are different. And so actually when you describe supporting what feels like a narrow community, actually you bring in factors that spread across the entire population in the States. But we take that seriously because the existing segmentations just don't apply. So really the short answer is we're learning as much about our customers as we can. We're treating that incredibly carefully because as protected classes, safety for us means things like don't out somebody, don't dead name somebody, don't make sure your data is available to a Russian airport because we don't know what the impact of our data could have outside of our own walled garden. So we use a really wide variety of data to be able to serve the unique needs of our community.
Thanks. Rob, real quickly, I wanted to follow up a little bit on the way that you were thinking about data as a startup. I mean, obviously Citi is at the other end of the spectrum, and I'd love to want to ask Jasmine kind of a related question too, but starting with you as a startup, how does that kind of influence your thinking about data collection, data use, and those kinds of concerns?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. Every startup has really a series of growth spurts, and we have to get to the next one, otherwise we don't survive. So we are about to close our seed round sometime this week, which is great. That gives us 12 to 18 months to focus on getting to product market fit. And so what that means is that we've built a product that is viable, usable, and desirable by our community. So the data we use really actively is going to range from analytical data on how people are using the product. Specific demographic data helps us to target the groups that we're going to go after first, because Rome wasn't built in a day and neither is any startup. So the ability to start small and be focused is really important. And so we look at the combination of who the person is, what their unique personal situation tells us about their banking needs, what their health situation might tell us about their banking needs. And then once we have those informations, we might use that to, say, target a group. In our example, we're targeted values-based LGBT folks because actually a lot of people want to spend with purpose but don't know how. But once we get into our product, we look at all of the analytical data, who does what, by what segment, and so on. That's the stuff that allows us as an early stage startup to have a product that works really well. I think the main thing we think about two things. We need that data to help us to survive. If we don't get to Series A, we've helped nobody. And we've got a mission that is really important to close the LGBT wealth gap and create a more equitable system. And that's really front and center of how we think about how we do work. But the second thing that is a must-have at the top of every time we talk about data is how do we keep our customers safe? Because safety for us is really important. LGBT people retire in places that are 40% more expensive because it's safer for us. We live in cities because it's safer for us. And so safety has to be part of the equation at every step of the way. Now, I was very vulnerable in sharing multiple examples of how I'm a protected class, but I wanted to do that to make this real. If my health status got out, that could be a real barrier for me. If my LGBT status, that could be a real barrier for me if that got out. But my co-founder Billy is a trans woman, and I think we need to understand for members of our own community how we don't even get to control all of the data that is being held about us. Because for a trans woman who is able to update their identity record to get their FICO score changed, we then provide a comprehensive credit score to landlords, to employers that out those people as trans folks. And so we have to think not only, and sadly, Not everyone wants to let trans folk live in their homes, and not everyone wants to give trans folk their jobs. It's wrong, but it is the nature of the secondary consequences of data for us. So we have to think about not only what is necessary for keeping our business alive, what is necessary to provide a great service for our customers, what's necessary to keep them safe. We also have to think about the secondary and tertiary uses of that data, because this is a very leaky financial services system that we operate in, and the consequences on communities like ours can be really, really, can be devastating. So we take this stuff really, really seriously just because we have to. It's an important part of our brand.
Thanks. Jasmine, with regard to the Action for Racial Equity initiative, how are you thinking about measurement of impact in that space? That's a really large initiative, and it seems like there are a lot of moving pieces there.
There are a ton of moving pieces, and I appreciate that. And Rob, I appreciate you raising the intersectionality point, which we often don't raise when it comes to financial inclusion, that we carry multiple identities, and those identities influence our access, our level of support, engagement, as well as oftentimes, as you just said, wealth. So as I mentioned early on in my remarks, we took the first approach of looking at data, of the macro data and the data and expertise that we had internally. The second thing that we did was really take a look at our business capabilities as investors. So we mobilized the business functions and teams across the investment bank and the consumer bank to look and embed initiatives within portfolios, so nothing siloed. So that means it's easy for us to track and measure over time. And a lot of my time is working daily with the business leaders to identify how we can streamline approaches, how we can accelerate access points, or figure out what new tools we need to put in place to make it more accessible for consumers. So really quickly, we realized it wasn't just about getting these investments up and going, but really about changing our mindsets about how we engage consumers and realizing how we do things really mattered and had an impact on the outside of things. So as I shared in the consumer bank, we really shored up programs and platforms to ensure that consumers improve either access to credit, scoring, or mortgage access. And in our update in April, we actually outlined a few of what those initiatives look like. We're also partnering closely with minority deposit-taking institutions to help them generate revenue, but also strengthen their ability to reach and serve consumers, oftentimes in places where we don't have a retail presence or where we're not available. So for us, it's more of a systemic, how do we build the field and leverage our core capabilities to do so? And that requires data and technology to do so. That third piece of that is also, engaging with private and public collaborations like the OCC's Project Reach. And that is where data and understanding what consumer insights and needs are is front and center for that initiative. And we hope further support regulatory support. And I know Daylight's probably looking at some of the issues now and the drivers around the policy lens to protecting and looking at consumer data. And then lastly, to your point, we do have to be proactive about being accountable. We do have to look at ourselves, our own internal policies. And that really is a commitment that wasn't just a nice to do, but it's the fourth pillar of our entire initiative. And for us, it really was, how do we embed what we believe are anti-racist or not focused on a particular consumer group, but those things that are universal, those things that align with our brand, our thought leadership, and how we believe access should be available and engaging for all. It is early days, so September to June 9th. It still feels new. What's exciting that there's more initiatives coming, but what also is kind of keeping us focused on a North Star is this notion that we do have to track and look at those investments very closely and do so in partnership to really understand the economic value of the investments we made besides the dollar amounts that we committed.
Okay, thank you. There's so much to cover here, and I do want to save a little time at the end. I guess before we turn to the audience questions, maybe each of you could share one lesson learned so far in your journeys as you're kind of thinking about these questions. And if someone is coming to you and thinking about launching their own DEI initiative, or focus on a particular customer demographic, what's an important top of mind consideration to suggest to those folks?
I would say, if I could, first, implementation feasibility. I think everybody sees large banks and says, of course you could do this. But I think at the end of the day, it's important to right size based on the size of your institution and the scale and the scope by which you all want to lead. The other thing is, what does it cost for us to really do it? Both indirect costs, staffing costs. This is my full-time job. It is a constant but exciting and a growth opportunity for all of us, and we're only learning that there's nothing but possibilities in the work that we're doing. Differentiation is another key one. At the end of the day, what's unique about your institution that you want to leverage? Don't try to run anybody else's race. How do you run your own on some of these topics? Focus on the consumer groups or the segments that you're most focused on or proud about or think you can really make an impact. And also there's a difference between scale and innovation. Sometimes it works to just go faster and bigger as opposed to doing something new. And I think being cautious about those two things are key.
Great. Rob?
Yeah, I think you'll notice that Daylight is part of a cohort of neobanks that are focusing on individual communities that have been underserved by large financial institutions. And I think one thing that we've learned, and that I touched upon earlier, but that I'm noticing each of my counterparts in those businesses is doing, is going deeper than most folks would in understanding the community that you're trying to serve. When I said before the LGBT community isn't a monolithic group, I gave you 2 examples of people at extreme ends, and then I gave you 3 different pieces of data that inform how I might need a product developed. And I'd say, if there's one lesson learned, and you want to treat a customer segment seriously, don't skimp on sampling, don't skimp on research, learn about them. Don't try and shoehorn them into existing personas, existing finance journeys, because here's the reality. If you do that to queer folk, you won't pick up co-parents, you won't pick up non-monogamy. You may have a judgment about whether those things are right. Those are realities now. The world has changed very fast. And so I think take nothing for granted, do the homework, talk to the customers, understand their lives, because when you do that, you can create superior products. And very much we started this exercise because we think we can do that faster and better than anybody else. But we do believe that a second role that I have is educating others about how they can do better by our community through campaigns like Call Me By My Name, which calls on greater trans inclusion, which is just something that nobody really thought about. And I think very much D&I initiatives are really important, but the thing to remember is we have been here the whole time. All of these communities have been living great financial lives, whether they've been a focused area or not. So rather than treat them as new and interesting things to discover, figure out what you haven't understood about people that have been on your books for a long time would be my top piece of advice.
Okay, thanks. We only have a minute or 2 left for questions, and I'm going to try and do a little combination action. Rob, a couple of things. One is, one of the questions was about, are there kind of best practices that you're able to share with social services providers, and if those are evident yet. But the other question is, I wanted to return to your focus on kind of the safety question and how we do that. Now, obviously, there are regulatory constraints in the U.S., particularly in the lending context, about collecting certain types of data. In some cases, it's mandated to collect. In some cases, it's generally prohibited. Obviously, we need to think through the regulatory requirements that apply. But some of this is not about regulatory. It's more about thinking more deeply about customer trust and relationship building. And I just want to talk briefly, if you could, about what are some of the practices that you're really focused on to both safeguard the data, but also communicate with your customers about what you're doing to safeguard the data. So, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I think we're pretty early on. I mean, if you use my example of a protected class with another protected class, talking about HIV, talking about parenting, there's a lot of complexity there to compliance. So I'm going to put that to a side now because we recognize that is going to be new. It's going to have a lot of work to be able to navigate through that in a compliant way. What instead I'll talk about is somebody who's trans. We have a number of golden rules, and one of them is never dead name anybody. Now, for those of you that don't understand what that means, most trans people will adopt a chosen name that reflects their the gender that they are. The dead name is considered something that is in bad taste to reference and is deeply offensive. So our golden rule of never dead name anybody, we don't just take that on the card. We offer cards with whatever name you'd like. That has to extend to CRMs. That has to extend to the push notifications, your credit checking systems. And so I think we think of data as from a customer experience lens, because there is physical safety, there's financial safety, and there is emotional safety. And dead naming somebody, there is no excuse for it. There is zero excuse for anybody on this call to have a platform that dead names a trans person, because trans people represent 0.5 to 1% of the population. They've been here the whole time. We just haven't caught up. And so the way we like to think about data is what gives the dignity to the customer, what treats them with the respect they're due, and how do we ensure their physical safety? Because actually, for a trans person of color, their life expectancy is closer to 35 than 45. So these things are lifesavers for our community. They're deeply important. And so we appoint people that are responsible for that. I have a head of no dead naming. I have a head of never outing somebody. And those are roles that are identified in our organization in order to make sure that there's a clear line of accountability, and that we're delivering not just on what regulatory standards are, which go a long way but don't go far enough, otherwise we wouldn't be dead naming people at all. So we see regulatory as the baseline, and we have to then build on top of it in order to serve our customers with safety, with dignity, and with respect.
Can I just say that Citi has the same exact policy in the sense that we launched True Name last year in June to really, to make sure that our commitment and our values to identifying people as they want to be named was very critical and central to that work. So absolutely, to what Rob said, I think dead naming is, at Citi, definitely something that we consider, and thank God we've got something in place to acknowledge that and to respect the clients that we have.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I think we are just about out of time. Rob, were there any kind of best practices that you wanted to share with social service providers, or is that something we should come back to you at the next conference about?
I think that's probably for the next conference, given the amount of time that we've got, but happy to have somebody share that question by email, and I'd be happy to see if I can respond.
Fabulous. Well, it's just been such an honor to talk to you all today. So many interesting questions. I mean, I think one of the things that struck us as we've been working in this space is there are always concerns about data and customer protection for any population. Consumers have such a complicated environment to navigate today in terms of who has their data, what the data is used for. And I think especially when it comes to secondary, uses, really thinking through what information you need for what purposes, can you minimize that to accomplish your purpose and measure your impact while, protecting the security and various other kinds of safety and privacy considerations. So it's so helpful to talk to both of you about this. And thanks to our audience for joining us, and to Financial Health Network for organizing this panel. It's been a great conversation and really enjoyed talking. So
thank you. Real pleasure.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciated the time.
Thank you for that, Rob, Jasmine, and Kelly. And I want to particularly say thank you to Rob for making a deliberate choice to be vulnerable and unpacking in detail the needs of the LGBTQ plus population. It really helps us in the understanding of the critical role that data has on meeting people's financial health and some of the risks and opportunities associated with using this data. Something that it's important and that we heard is that disaggregating data really allows organizations to identify the varying needs and evaluate what products need to be offered or what policies and practices need to be adjusted. We heard our panelists talk about expenses, healthcare, family composition, timelines, and milestone moments that need to be considered when thinking about someone's financial health. So really, really appreciate the panel unpacking all of this. Thank you very much for that powerful presentation. Now, I want to move us along. As an organization, we know the importance that leaders have in building a more accessible and inclusive financial system. And for that reason, we have created the Financial Health Visionary Award, which recognizes individuals who have shown unparalleled leadership in building a more accessible and inclusive financial system, and who seek to continue to inspire and encourage the next generation of leaders to innovate the financially underserved. This year's award goes to someone that has shown this commitment at a global level. In this next session, I am thrilled to introduce you to Jennifer Tetcher, our President and CEO, who will present the Financial Health Visionary Award. We'll hear from Jennifer shortly.
Good afternoon, everybody. As I said during my presentation yesterday, leadership is one of the 5 key ingredients of a financial health for all movement. And that's why we focused on leadership during day 2 of Emerge. It's also the rationale behind the Financial Health Visionary Award. The award recognizes individuals who have shown unparalleled leadership toward building a more accessible and inclusive financial system, and who seek to continue to inspire and encourage other leaders to make financial health a strategic priority. And I have the distinct honor today of helping pass the torch from our first awardee to our second. Dan Schulman, the CEO and president of PayPal, was our inaugural recipient of the Visionary Award in 2018. It's almost impossible to summarize briefly why we selected Dan for this award, because the list of ways he has championed financial health is voluminous. Simply put, Dan has woven financial health into everything that he says and does. It's fair to say that his efforts, frankly, inspired us to create the award in the first place. Dan's leadership has continued unabated over the last 3 years. We've seen it in PayPal's response to the pandemic and to the racial reckoning sparked by the murder of George Floyd, and we've seen it in his leadership on issues such as gun violence and voting rights. Possibly his most significant effort has been around employee financial health. When PayPal measured the financial health of its own employees, it realized that they didn't have enough of a financial buffer to provide the kind of resilience and opportunity that brings stability and peace of mind, and that makes for a productive workforce. And so Dan and team made a series of changes around health insurance costs, stock grants, and other kinds of benefits, which have had a direct and measurable impact. Dan has gone on to use his platform to call on all CEOs to put worker financial health at the top of their agendas. One of the fun parts of being a Visionary Award winner is getting to help choose the next recipient. Dan played a critical role in the selection process, and he's not done yet, because now he'll be our first Visionary Award alum. So Dan, thank you for your leadership, your partnership, and your friendship. Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce you to our 2021 Visionary Award recipient, Her Majesty Queen Maxima of the Netherlands. Queen Maxima has been a tireless champion of financial inclusion, with over a decade serving as the United Nations Secretary General's special advocate for inclusive finance for development. As the special advocate, Her Majesty is a leading global voice on advancing universal access to and responsible usage of affordable, effective, and safe financial services. She advocates for financial inclusion at a global and country level, all in close collaboration with partners from the public and private sectors. An important focus of her work is enabling responsible technology for financial inclusion in support of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. Since 2011, more than 1.2 billion people have gained access to financial services around the world, which in turn ignites faster progress on the Sustainable Development Goals, and it improves economic and social outcomes for vulnerable segments. Queen Maxima has also been involved in the development of the OECD's International Network on Financial Education, launched in 2008, and now has members from over 125 countries. Complementing her work as the special advocate in the Netherlands, she advocates for the importance of financial education and managing money sensibly, especially for vulnerable groups. Her Majesty is the honorary chair of the MoneyWise, a platform launched by the Dutch Ministry of Finance to improve the financial fitness of Dutch citizens. Several years ago, she helped launch the Dutch Debt Lab, an initiative that brings together involved stakeholders to jointly address the problem of over-indebtedness at a late stage, as well as to identify instruments to signal early debt distress. This approach, based on applying best practices and proven methods, has now been implemented in more than 40 municipalities in the Netherlands, and it's expanding to serve specific vulnerable groups, such as farmers and SMEs. I had long admired Her Majesty's work around the globe, and then I had a chance to meet her during a visit she made to PayPal's offices back in 2017. During an intimate roundtable discussion that she and Dan hosted, I became even more impressed. She's a careful listener. She asks really smart questions. The depth of her empathy and commitment shined through in that conversation, as did her sophisticated and nuanced understanding of the global inclusion challenge and the path forward. The next year following that roundtable, Queen Maxima launched the CEO Partnership for Financial Inclusion, a partnership among a diverse set of leading multinational companies formed to accelerate financial inclusion around the world, and Dan and PayPal were very involved in that effort. One of the most notable elements of the effort was her focus on broadening the inclusion tent beyond banks and financiers to include consumer goods companies like PepsiCo and Unilever, and linking broader issues of workers and supply chains to the inclusion dialogue. More recently, she's been using her voice and her platform to lift up the importance of financial health as the North Star of inclusion efforts. In December of last year, Queen Maxima launched a financial health working group with leaders from financial and development sectors, including our own Financial Health Network. The working group aims to develop a shared vision for how to advocate for key decision makers, both public and private, to use the lens of financial health, looking at outcomes instead of only access and usage of financial services. And we're so excited to be partners in this work. For all of these reasons and more, we are honored to present Queen Maxima with the 2021 Financial Health Network Visionary Award.
Her Majesty Queen Maxima of the Netherlands has been the UN Secretary General's Special Advisor on Financial Inclusion for Development since 2009.
She has tirelessly traveled the globe. She talks to government bodies, decision-making bodies.
And the good news is huge progress has been made. Since 2011, the number of people with a financial account has grown by 1.2 billion people.
I have been working for more than a decade on what we call financial inclusion. That is giving everyone, everywhere, the financial services they need to protect themselves against hardship, to invest in the future, and to really finally be able to be part of economic progress. So we still have 1.7 billion people to go, but also I think we need to pay a better attention on the quality of these services, because in the end of the day, these services are there to improve the lives of people, improve their cash flows, improve their, financial lives, and also make it possible for them to protect themselves against shocks.
It actually gives me goosebumps hearing it. It's the idea that you actually tailor the products to the individual, and then it's not just about giving them financial access, it's actually about giving them access to products they can use.
We need to empower everyone and bring them into the digital financial services. And my thanks to Queen Maxima for tirelessly championing this issue and making sure that it's about everyone, not just a few.
And Your Majesty, I know that with your leadership, with your enthusiasm, and with your mobilization capacity, this is going to move even more quickly in the next 10 years.
We must dig more deeply into how to deliver real value to to the poor. Ultimately, improving lives is a promise of financial inclusion.
For your incredible work, and Your Majesty, congratulations.
No. Well, thank you very much for this wonderful compliment. But like you very well said, this work is all being done in conjunction with many, many other partners. And I think when you talk about leadership, it takes the leadership of many, many partners to be able to get to 1.2 billion people and actually making the changes that we need. So I would take that as an encouragement for all of us to keep on working.
Exactly, exactly. Now, you've been working in the financial inclusion space for over a decade at both the state level in your royal capacity as Queen of the Netherlands, as well as at the global level as the United Nations Secretary General's Special Advocate for Inclusive Finance for Development. And that, I will say, is a mouthful. Tell us a little bit more about what brought you to this work, right? You could have taken on any cause you wanted, given your platform and role. Why this one?
Well, first of all, I grew up in Argentina. I was born and raised there. And I grew up at a moment that actually economically, macroeconomically, things were not doing very well. I lived more than 2,000% inflation per year. And I saw middle class and actually a lot of people crumbling in their financial needs and also not being able to be included in economic progress. So, and I study economics, right? So at an own stage when I was 17 years old, actually when I was 14 years old, I said to myself, I have to be able to do something to help this. So I think from a very early stage, I thought about, how can we actually get into the macroeconomics, being able to help the micro. So that's how I got into the little by little in the whole financial inclusion, of course, with a little bit of a sidestep of being a banker in New York and try to help that to an emerging markets on that side. And then by the time I got to the Netherlands, I had done some work in financial inclusion. So then we started with the UN and it became a big financial inclusion agenda like we right now know it. But what was interesting is in the very first years that I was here in the Netherlands, and the Netherlands is a very rich country, right? So, comparison to Argentina, there's a very big difference. And a lady that was working with me, a very highly educated person, was about to buy a home in the Netherlands. And she came up very stressed out and she said to me, well, I don't know what mortgage to get. And so I said, come over, I'll sit down with you. And the funny thing is that she couldn't understand the very basic issues of the mortgages, interest rates, and what type, and the small letter, etc. So, and then when I talked to her, but listen, if you get into this, you will get into trouble if actually interest rates rise. So I realized that this whole issue of being able to cope with all this information is not granted just because you study philosophy or, or even sometimes financial studies. So this issue about, being aware of knowledge of financial issues and also the behavior of actually having a behavior that leads you to a good financial stable life was made very present. And that's when we started doing the MoneyWise work here in the Netherlands. And when we pushed through the Mexican presidency of the G20 to set up in the OECD the INFE, which is actually what globalized knowledge and best practices at the OECD for financial education. So yes, what we want to do with MoneyWise is that there is a chapter at schools that teaches you, the very specific things about risks. How do you handle risks? How do you budget? How do you save? If you want to have a long-term expenditure, how do you go about that? The dangers of actually, too much debt, but also going to specific groups. And I will talk about students, pensioners. How do you prepare yourself to a pension life? And, it's been some years now and with a lot of successes, I have to say, but it's been a very interesting journey and we've been learning as we were doing. So that's also been a very interesting thing. And in the meantime, something very interesting happened, which is before people that were highly indebted were treated like, you're fraudulent, you don't want to pay your, your debt back. So I will put you more fines and I will put you more, deadlines, and even every time the deadline is closer and shorter. And I think that we started, we were already talking about this, but I think the general public started to understand that if you get yourself into high debt, it's not always your fault. Sometimes as somebody got sick, you already had a very thin, balanced financial life, and suddenly got sick, or when your children got sick, or you make one day a bad decision and you follow it for 5, 6 years, and through fines, through interest rates, it just gets into such a big ball that you don't know what else to do. And then you don't sleep anymore. And that financial stress really takes over your life. Yes. So that's why we set up this with the Debt Lab, which is in principle to cure these 500,000 households in the Netherlands that have somewhat problematic debts, but hopefully to prevent not to have them, so as to have all the Dutch people, and I hope all the world, without this financial stress.
Right. Well, I take many things from the story of your journey, but one of them is your great empathy. And I think you and Dan have that in common. Dan, talk a little bit about why you thought Her Majesty should receive this award.
There's so many things to talk about that, but first of all, Jen, let me thank you for all the amazing work that you and your team do. May you inspire both me, PayPal, Her Majesty, I know, and so many others, and so many of your concepts and so many of your studies have opened my eyes to so many different things. So thank you for that. Where do I start with Her Majesty? I mean, she's an inspiration to so many of us. I think we've really stepped up the bar for who can receive this going forward. I mean, I'm here, and Her Majesty is doing so many other things on top of that. And, I've known Her Majesty for quite some time now. We are involved in the same passion in terms of helping those that are underserved, that are most vulnerable and need our help. She's turned into a good friend over the years. I enjoy every moment that we spend together. But what I love about Her Majesty is she doesn't need to be doing this. I mean, she's the Queen of the Netherlands. She can do whatever she wants to go do. Mm-hmm. And helping those who are underserved, helping those that need our help, that struggle every single day, every single moment at the end of the month as they're trying to put and juggle all of their essential living needs, their bills, their insurance. This is hard, tough work that you have to slog it out. It is not just proclamations. It is not trying to work with a couple of governments to do this. This is on the ground work. And then what I have seen over the years from Her Majesty is this fervent passion, her ability to motivate so many of us to not give up, to keep pushing, to be able to convene government officials, private and public partnerships. She travels all the time to the countries that, most people don't ever go to. And I have the utmost of admiration for her. She is the real deal, and we can all be inspired for her. And, Your Majesty, I just want to congratulate you on this award. It's going to be hard to follow you for the third recipient, but hopefully we'll figure out who that might be, and congratulations.
You mentioned, Dan, the importance of partnerships. And as I mentioned a few moments ago, Your Majesty, your team launched this financial health working group back at the end of last year to augment the global conversation, to focus not only on inclusion or sort of access, if you will, but also on financial health. What led you to take that step and start this working group? I mean, as I mentioned, you've been doing inclusion for a long time. It's really important work. Why make this this next step?
I always said that financial inclusion is a means to an end. I mean, for somebody to have just a saving, you don't become better. If that saving account is not a conduit for you to actually have a better life in general, to be able to, have a buffer for unforeseeable risks, or being able to invest in something you really want to build up with your family and send your daughters to, to school, or invest in a little firm that you always wanted, that dream you always had, then, I mean, to be honest with you, financial inclusion doesn't have any purpose whatsoever. So financial inclusion is the means. Financial health and the outcome of actually being able to be part of an economic, overall economic life is the purpose. And so it's a very natural thing to do. And I would say that without financial health and developmental outcomes, financial inclusion would be a very hollow shell. Having said that, without having the access and the products out there, I wouldn't be able to do that work. So it took me some years to actually have the 1.2 billion people that they actually have access to this payment account to start with, and then being able to actually do savings, and then themselves have access to an insurance, life insurance. So the husband dies, the actual family gets it. Harvest insurance or health insurance. Then I can make those changes, right? Or we can actually promote those changes. But without that, getting to those people with the right products, we can't really do it.
Yeah. So Dan, you have been on this same journey of helping folks to understand the mindset shift that's required to focus on outcomes. And you talk to many, many business leaders around the globe. How do you think that shift is going? Do you think there's increasing buy-in? Is it getting easier to explain? I'm assuming the pandemic maybe has made your job, unfortunately, a little easier, perhaps?
Mm-hmm. Well, Jen, as always, the first time I really talked about financial health was with you, as we started to move our thinking, like Her Majesty, from access to really the outcome that we all need. I mean, I think the pandemic probably helped expose, some really disturbing trends around the world. It lowered the overall water level, but, there have been these issues that have been going on for quite some time. And I think, although we've brought a lot of people theoretically into the system, there's still 1 billion plus people who are outside the system completely right now. And I would say you have to at least double that for those who are in the system but underserved by the system, that still are charged, fees that are probably too high and interest rates that are too high for basic transactions that more affluent people, get free of charge. And I think the issue is such that, and I think a lot of people think about this as, those who are in extreme poverty, but this is much broader than that. In the U.S. alone, there's something like, and the U.S. is a developed country, there are 185 million adults that really struggle, that are financially stressed at the end of every single month. This is really, in my way of thinking about it, the new middle class. And this is a real issue for the stability of, our economies. I would argue for the stability of our democracies as well. I think the foundation for us to have a thriving democracy is that people can rise above their own self-interests. And if you feel the system is letting you down because you just can't make it work no matter how hard you're trying, then you start to radicalize and you start to move towards extremes, and the ability to have thoughtful, rational conversations about how we can advance as a whole become much more difficult. And I think we are witnessing that. And so I think this move towards financial health is crucial in so many ways. And every one of us has a role to play in that. And I think we should take advantage of whatever positions we are in to drive financial health. And, that is obviously part and parcel of the mission PayPal, but it's also part and parcel of what drives you and Your Majesty and myself and so many others in our zeal to try and address that issue.
Yeah. Well, in our closing moments together, you went right where I was going to go, Dan, as usual, which is, many of the people listening to this and who will listen to it by recording later, these are leaders who get this, who care about this very much. And I challenged people yesterday to say that what we really need now is to build a financial health for all movement. And that it's not a one-time, once a year emerge kind of event, that this is, as you said, it's an unrelenting focus. If you could, share one piece of advice or one call to action for leaders in this movement, what would it be? And you could say anything you want, Dan, but one thing that we haven't had much chance to talk about now is the importance of this for employers. That might be one thing you might want to talk about. And then I'll give the last word to Her Majesty.
Yeah, that's a good thing to go do. So I do think that leadership matters. It always has, but it really matters in this. And even if you can only impact one or two people, that matters. But as CEOs of companies, I don't think we can rely or should rely on just the public sector to help address so many of the ills that we face as a society. One thing we clearly have in our control is the financial health of our own employees. And I think, I was shocked when I measured that. And I think you have to have a measurement, right? We use net disposable income. How much money does somebody have left over after they pay all of their taxes and essential living expenses? And you measure that location by location. But we found out, and we're PayPal, we pay at or above market in all markets. We found out that for our entry-level employees, for our call center employees, their typical NDI was between 4 and 6%. So naturally, they were stressed out at the end of the month. We had high attrition, people worried about what they were going to do. And, we made a commitment inside the company that the minimum NDI that any employee could have is 20%. Like increase that by 4 to 5 times from where it was. And today we're at 18%. We've lowered the cost of healthcare benefits, as you mentioned, gave everybody equity in the company, raised salaries where we needed to, wrapped it all in a financial literacy and program so people could understand it. But I'll tell you, that has made all the difference in the world in terms of our ability to attract employees. It has reduced our attrition, voluntary attrition, to almost zero. Wow. Our customer NPS scores are at record levels. And I think we all can do that kind of thing. And I think we should encourage each other at a minimum to start measuring the financial health of our employees. And then everyone can figure out what the right way is to start to help there.
Excellent. Thanks. Your Majesty, the final word.
Well, it's a very dangerous thing, but I think that, just filling up with what just Dan said, I think that first of all, yes, private sector has a big role to play. And I hope that as a result of the working group that you just mentioned, that we can actually agree on a couple of, KPIs, measurements for the private sector and for the public sector, that we can actually start having, because measuring is knowing and is actually much easier to advocate. And so that we can actually start telling all these private sector players, listen, it may seem it costs you money, but you will make more money. And I think that's a little bit the paradox we will need to actually win over. Something that seems to cost you money will actually give you back money with loyalty, with productivity, we know that when an employee is actually having financial stress, his IQ goes down. 1 in every 3 employees said they have difficulty concentrating. So imagine if that wouldn't, because of financial problems. So imagine that wouldn't be there. And like Dan said, it's also stability of systems. So that also goes for the public sector and how we can actually do so the public sector and the private sector work together in ways of like we do here in the Netherlands, okay, there's a part that the private sector can do, and then there's a part the public sector can take over in certain fields, but we need to work together a lot. And we need to know a lot more what are the determinants for that financial health. And I think that's something that we need to do together. And I'm really thankful for the leadership of PayPal, with Dan, of course, on the lead, and yourself at the network, because, with your voices, we can actually try to get those type of sort of, definitions, KPIs, and try to get to the public and private sector in a way that we're effective. And hopefully in 10 years' time, when we actually get a GDP numbers out, we can actually say, what is the financial health of the population out?
Yes. Well, onward. I know I am incredibly excited by this conversation. So thank you, Dan Schulman, for your incredible contributions, and congratulations again to Your Majesty, Queen Maxima. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a truly inspiring story. And I hope that we continue embracing financial health globally and continue working towards measuring financial health, taking action, and tracking those efforts. Before closing our day 2 for Emerge Financial Health, and I hope that you're joining us tomorrow, I'd like to reflect about today's sessions along with my colleague, Tia Guerin, who leads our financial health polls at the Financial Health Network. Tia, thank you so much for joining me. Just to get us started, I guess we covered a lot of ground today. Why don't you tell me what resonated with you?
Absolutely, would be glad to. Before I jump into my reflections, first I just want to say what a fantastic first 2 days of sessions. I know that sometimes engaging in a virtual format can be challenging, but I personally haven't been able to look away. We've just really had some great content, great panelists. So reflecting on today's group of sessions, I want to start with what is perhaps not a very happy takeaway, but I heard a number of our panelists sound what I would call an alarm about various crises, multiple interrelated but distinct crises that are unfolding as we speak, that have been unfolding for years in some cases, that affect not just individual populations, but society as a whole. So we heard Scott Sanborn from London Club speak of a financial health crisis. He cited our pulse data showing that 2/3 of people in the United States are not financially healthy. We heard Elaine Bigelow from the National Partnership for Women and Families speak of a caregiving crisis. She shared what I would call some very staggering statistics. 10 million people cite caregiving as a reason that they stopped working. She also cited the statistic that $500 billion have been lost in economic opportunity simply because of lack of access to paid leave. We heard Jasmine Thomas at Citi talk about the racial wealth gap, which has remained largely unchanged over the past few decades, also correlates with high amounts of lost economic opportunity over the past few decades. And finally, we heard Rob Curtis from Daylight talk about challenges amongst members of the LGBT community. He began speaking about a total lack of data about this important community at the national level, but the data that he did cite was pretty alarming. He spoke of higher rates of mental health challenges amongst this diverse group, safety challenges that many in this community face, as well as a life expectancy, that was closer to 35 years for queer people of color. So really some alarming, some staggering statistics. But on a more positive note, I also heard a lot of optimism from our speakers today. Many of them pointed to solutions that are in reach and spoke about progress that has been happening in recent years. And I think that perhaps one of the most unanticipated outcomes of the past year was this enhanced popular awareness, enhanced common understanding of racial inequities and structural barriers, particularly for communities of color. Drawing upon our panelists' remarks and reflecting on those, we again heard Elaine speak of this care infrastructure. She spoke about how this holistic package of services was actually quite politically popular across the aisle, and she's optimistic that progress on that front for a holistic care infrastructure package may actually happen in the next few years. On that same panel, we heard Kavya speak about how employers are beginning to understand the need to invest in solutions. She also mentioned optimism, that she's really starting to see change on that front. Jasmine, I thought, provided a great example of financial service providers, groups like Citi explicitly adopting anti-racist policies, as well as other policies with an eye to inclusion, such as avoiding dead naming. She and Rob discussed that. And then Rob, I thought, so nicely represented this new cohort of fintech providers, new innovators who are tackling issues, in his case, particularly relevant to the LGBT community, but also many other fintechs going deep on understanding various communities of interest. So, the challenges before us are great, but I personally was heartened to hear such optimism, and such a focus on realistic, tangible, achievable solutions from the group.
Yeah, well said, Thea. I mean, you just gave us a really great summary of today, and I fully agree. These conversations are truly powerful, and if anything, as you said, the pandemic really got people talking and what's going on and what have been the structural barriers that were not a consequence of the pandemic, but we've had for such a long time, and now it's time to think about solutions that are really long-term. It's not just solutions for the pandemic, but solutions that are real to solve some of those, or start thinking about how they solve some of those structural barriers. I have one last question for you. If you can quickly tell us, we talk a lot about the inequities deeply ingrained in systems across gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation. And we knew that those existed before, right? We talked about that. And, by now we know who has been affected the most. We know what the numbers look like. What is the point of continuing measuring financial health? You and I talk about this a lot, but why should organizations, governments care about continuing measuring when we know what the problems are?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it's frankly a question that I would answer by saying that measurement is now more important than ever, right? We need to continue measuring because we simply cannot accept the status quo. We now know that there are these massive financial health disparities exist between populations, between women and men, amongst populations of color, but that does not mean that they will always exist. So we can't just say we understand the issues. We cannot become complacent. We need to continue diving deeper, continuing to track to better understand financial health trends amongst these populations. Because again, if the last year has taught us anything, it's that millions of people, particularly low-income communities, particularly communities of color, are living on the edge with unacceptably high degrees of financial fragility. And again, I'll stress, it does not have to be that way. So only by continuing to collect data about financial health, about people's well-being, can we truly understand how people in the United States are faring financially. And we can't stop there. We need to disaggregate that data. So we come back to this theme again and again, but I don't think it can be said enough. We cannot assume that averages or national statistics tell the full story. They simply do not. And, the K-shaped recovery of the last year has taught us that. We need to dig deeper. We need to disaggregate. We need to look between populations and within populations as much as possible. And Rob from Daylight, I think, really made this point well. We can't assume we know everything about one community just from those top line, those aggregate statistics. And finally, we need to use data to inform our decision making. So each and every one of our speakers this afternoon, I thought, provided great examples of how they're doing this in their own ways. But whether you are a financial service provider, whether you're an employer or government entity, we need to all be using data to determine whether the solutions we're developing are making an actual difference in people's financial lives. Without collecting that ongoing sort of data, we simply don't know if these policies and solutions are making a difference.
Yeah, that was a wonderful way to end today. So thank you so much for those remarks. And as we close out our second day of this event, we'd love to know what conversations and topics struck a chord with you. So please answer. We're going to be sending a question shortly here so you can tell us what resonated with you. And that brings us to the conclusion of today's sessions on zooming in people and leaders. Before we wrap, I encourage you to join us tomorrow from 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. Central Time, where we will be spotlighting a few of the most promising and successful financial health partnerships, commitments, and solutions of the year. I'm sure you won't want to miss it. So we hope to see you then. Thank you for joining us.